everybody! Time for another What
That's
We
right.
Read.
Once more into the fray.
Alright.
Into the breach. I don't know. I'm just thinking of some weird
To the pages.
Captain-y thing. Cool.
Anyway, we'll dive right into the books that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to kick things off by talking about Blackwater Sister, which is by Zen Cho. This is the story of Jessamine. She moves back to Malaysia with her family because they're kind of broken in debt, and so they go to live with her dad's family. When she's there, she starts hearing voices, or at least she thinks so, and then she realizes her grandmother's ghost is haunting her.
Ooh.
The grandmother is asking her to help settle a sort of feud that's going on between a gang boss who has offended a deity called the Blackwater Sister in Malaysia. So that is the basic premise of the story, and it was very entertaining. I wouldn't quite classify this to be the same as the other sort of like urban fantasy stories I've read, because it's not YA and it's also not adult romance. It's fun, because I don't think I've ever read one where it's an adult fantasy story like this. So it has like YA vibes in terms of the plot, but it's adult. So it was just very interesting and fun to read. I liked being in Malaysia as a setting because I don't think I've ever read any stories set in Malaysia, nor have I really, experienced what sort of Malaysian lore is like when it comes to the supernatural. So I had no idea about most of the things in the story, and it was pretty fun just like getting to learn sort of tidbits about it, because Zen Cho sort of introduces them in a way that is really easy to understand, like easy to make sense of, really. I almost want to say it was filled with shenanigans, because it kind of was, because as you can imagine, having a ghost be in your brain and talking to you and occasionally possessing your body can't be an easy thing, and will often lead to some interesting circumstances. But this was also surprisingly heavy. There were a lot of violent acts in it that I was not anticipating. I don't know, it was just interesting. The only reason that I couldn't rate this a little bit higher, like personally, is just because I didn't feel like I had a very personal connection to Jess or to anyone in her life. I was very entertained by all of the things that happened in the story, and I also obviously wanted everything to work out well for like everyone involved, like everyone to find their peace, basically. So in terms of that, for me, it felt more like a plot-driven story that I was attracted to versus a character-driven story, which is generally what I prefer to be reading. So would I recommend it? Yes, because it was really fun, and I think it would definitely be an interesting experience for anyone who also hasn't experienced a lot of like Malaysian culture and lore. That part was definitely very fun. And if you're really looking for something that will read pretty fast because it is plot driven, this might be the book for you. So definitely check that out. The next book I'm going to talk about is a nonfiction book called Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, and this is by Kathy Park Hong. So the author is the daughter of Korean immigrants, and she has written a collection of essays that is inspired by her theory of minor feelings, which is basically when you believe sort of the lies that you've been fed about your racial identity, specifically in the context of American optimism in the face of anything that, they say or believe about your race. And I think that this one was interesting, but not necessarily what I expected, because it's a combination of being memoir style with like personal anecdotes, but also integrating a lot of history, especially about specific figures in Asian American history or Asian culture in general. It's just it was interesting, and I actually listened to this one and the author narrates it herself, so I guess that also enhanced my reading experience of it. And I did think that she had a lot of interesting things to say about her own feelings, but it almost felt as if like the entirety of this work is her grappling with those feelings, which on the one hand you can sort of relate to as someone, like in my case, I'm not Korean American, but I am Filipino American, so I can kind of relate to the displacement and sort of like the weird ups and downs of being Asian in America. But at the same time, it was also like you were reading her diary and it felt a little invasive, even though she chose to share it with you, obviously. But it kind of gave me the feeling where I was kind of like, I'm being privy to someone's like secrets and feelings.
I mean, some people are kind of into that.
Yeah, and I think that if that is the type of thing that you're into, it'll appeal to you more than it did to me. And at the end of the day, like, I am glad that I read it, because it did give me an additional perspective on how someone else might feel about certain things, and also about her own life and experiences. But yeah, for me, this was kind of like an okay thing for me to read. I am glad I read it, but I don't necessarily think that it met my personal expectation of what I thought it was going to be, if that makes any sense. So there's that. Alright, 14.
Right. I have a series of horror things. Just sort of, this is like the horror.
I mean, it is
I do
perfect.
try to be organized with like my groupings and stuff, because that's just
How you roll.
I just, yes, how I roll. So so let's start. Harrow County, which I may have referenced reading the first couple of volumes,
Yeah.
a couple of what we read
I
ago.
believe so.
It's continuing on. It's apparently kind of like critically acclaimed, award-winning-esque, you know, in its sort of
Oh, I
like
didn't know
feels.
that.
I did not know that either. But I would say that Cullen Bunn actually has done, like, I get the hype. Harrow County centers around a young girl who inadvertently discovers that she's somehow connected to the witch that was lynched about 18 years ago from the day she was born, G, who at the time of the witch's heyday, you know, healed a lot of, you know, folks, but also caused a lot of trouble and raised a lot of quite literal hell. And out of just fear that her power was running unchecked, she was murdered. And then her life began. And now those forces that have conspired to bring that witch to her untimely demise have caught up with said young girl, and now she has to make a choice between bridging the past into the future in the way that that witch would have done, or in the way that she, as an individual, would do. Volumes 3 and 4 sort of take us deeper into that world, and I gotta say, I love a good backstory. I love when something in the past comes rocketing back into the present and adds a level of depth and flavor to sort of like the horror. So yeah, so a lot of gore, a lot of like, there's a little boy there that's just like his skin, and then eventually you find what was underneath the skin and you don't know what's going on there. So it's a lot of sort of like dark magic, but very like, I'm sure it looks gory to a point, but it's very centered in, I want to say, American, and I would even say middle sort of American like lore. In a very Seventh Son of the Seventh Son type,
got it, yeah.
curses and hexes, and you know, sort of like this pastiche of things that that the settlers sort of brought with them, and that's sort of what that is. And it's certainly the art style is written in that way as well. So I drawn in that way as well. So that was sort of a treat. And now I am hovering over the buy button because Comixology Unlimited only lets you go until a certain set of volumes, and I'm just like,
And you're like, should I get
do
the
I really
rest?
want to get there? And I do. That's the other thing too. It's like you want to support your authors, but at the same time, priorities. So there's that. Something is Killing the Children, Volume 3. This I did buy. It's such a great series for me personally because again, it starts off with this young boy who has witnessed the murder of his friends.
Okay.
And this is a grotesque, brutal, dismembery kind of murder. And he had admitted to everyone that that was him. Of course, they're like, no, I couldn't have been you. Like, first of all, he's not even that big a kid. So for him to sort of like take the blame for these dismembered like children, there's no way that was you. So we'll just chalk this up as one of those weird occurrences. But the thing that did that is still out there, and this young woman from out of nowhere, pale white hair, just, you know, like armed with like a dagger and like this really cool sort of like scarfy, masky kind of thing with like a full set of teeth that have like fangs and stuff. So it looks like you've got teeth underneath the bandana. I think, you know, she was awesome, and she's the only one who can see them, along with the other children as well. So who is behind these? What is behind these murders? What is the secret society from which this young woman hails? That is actually more violent and terrible. It has a crazier agenda than even she's comfortable with. And what will she decide to do with that? That is what Volume 3 is about. It ended, I would say, I like the way it ended. Little open-ended, because that's what we do with these kinds of series. I hope that the world expands a bit more. But even if it ended on that third volume, I would say it would make a good sort of like Netflix series where it's just like a one and done, you know, kind of like, and it's very cool. Like if it ends there, then it'll be very Easternish storytelling, right? East Asian storytelling, where we just have the 19 episodes and then that's it. We're never going back to this place ever again, which is not how we do it here in the West.
I kind of prefer that too.
But
definitive endings.
But definitive endings is a sort of an art that we almost sort of lose here, as opposed to the 19 million times Iron Man has to, you know, be a jackass and be a good guy again. Like they just reset that clock, and it's just now I'm back, and I'm not a hero again, and then I'm a hero again, and then I'm not a hero again, and I'm a hero again, because I've been around for 75,000 years, which is not true for Iron Man, but it is true for some of the other Avengers. The mantle has been around from, like, they have Avengers 10,000 BC, for God's sake. So whatever. Moving on to some really badass female characters, right? Because it seems to be a theme with me. I don't know.
You do like reading about
I grew up in my cognitive, like functions were aware during the Charmed and Buffy, sort of like realms. So strong female characters are like a staple for me. Anything else is a little bit boring to me personally. Like have your cool dudes and awesome like whatevers, but I gotta have these cool girls. Trese, right? Alexandra Trese, the main character of titular series called Trese. It's now a Netflix series. It's written by Budget Tan and Kajo Baldissimo. Set in the Philippines, which has a very rich horror lore. I mean, it's almost like super morbid and gory. That you have a country where you like part of growing up is these terrible stories of sort of like these demon vampire things that sort of like some of them like separate half their body and they sprout wings and they just eat like fetuses from the womb and just these shapeshifters who turn into these grotesque monsters that will eat you at one point in time. You'll hear them clicking up from the top, but actually they're coming at you from the side. That's the kind of stuff that gets told around campfires. It's not like, ooh, scary ghost. I'm like, yeah, okay, scary ghost, sure. Nah, not back home. And so although there are ghosts as well, right? Some of them tied to specific locales, like Balete Drive, for example, is like a random street somewhere in the city in Manila. And there are ghosts there. People get lost there. People will turn like 19 right turns and end up at the same street. And nobody knows how to get out, right? That's the curse of sort of like a thing. So Trese happens to take all of those fantastical elements and turns them, in the comics, not in the TV series, into serialized like noir type case files where the police have to call Alexandra and go, hey, somebody was murdered on Balete Drive. And it's not a somebody, it's actually a ghost. Like they murdered the ghost on Balete Drive, which is actually the first series. It's actually called Volume 1, Murder on Balete Drive. And then from there it becomes a series of the fire that burnt down this city called Tondo. Has an elemental spirit behind it. And there's an involvement there, and how do we solve this problem, and then etc. So it just takes all of these fantastical elements and puts them in a noir setting, and then centers them around this very strong, very empowered young woman who has no choice but to take on the mantle of this whole kind of like, I am the bridge between the underworld and the overworld kind of deal. And I highly recommend it. I have only just read up to Volume 2, which is Unreported Murders, right? So, and I actually honestly prefer reading the comics to watching the Netflix series, even if the Netflix series is its own awesome thing.
It's pretty cool.
Mostly because it's a darker, grittier, more episodic, I want to say.
Yes.
Thing, and they had their work cut out for them. I know a couple of the writers from college who are working on the series right now, or who did write it on TV, and they had their work cut out for them. I think they did great with the source material, but the source material itself is such a goldmine. Any kind of an introduction into Philippine mythology, Trese is a good place to start if you're a horror fan. If you're not so much a horror fan, then maybe you want to try mythology class, which is also cool. But that's that. Finally, speaking of horrible things and strong female characters, I finally finished the Levi Black trilogy, Red Right Hand, Black Goat Blues, and third book is Death Goddess Dance. It solves the whole story of when this young woman is taken by this man in black who has a red right hand to be his sort of like avatar, and then she discovers that he's the complete jackass, or isn't he? And then plans within plans are revealed, and now this young woman has no choice but to pursue the only course of action left, which should ideally save the world. It's based on the Cthulhu sort of like mythos, right?
Yeah.
The H.P. Lovecraft sort of like pantheon of gods. It sort of definitely modernizes it. It chops it down to bite-sized pieces, but it's very gory. It keeps the whole Lovecraft gore thing, tentacles and brains and insanity and just wildly outlandish things. Keeps all of those elements. So it felt like one Easter egg after the other.
Okay.
So again, kind of like Trese, where you've got like all the Philippine lore here. It's, all the Lovecraftian greatest hits crammed into this nice, accessible story. And while different fans might have thoughts about that, from a purely narrative perspective, I think it worked great. It has all of the hallmarks of a decent shonen action sort of like movie type thing.
Okay.
With a strong character to lead it. An ending that to me was kind of satisfying, but also made you go, oh, I guess we don't have any more. Okay. So definitely a 4.5-ish start. I mean, because I just wanted, like, you know, what's gonna happen next. But then these things should end the way it did, I feel. Even if I don't like it personally, I feel, no, that's how you land something like this. Because there's only so much, you know, like, so only so much you can peel back from the cosmos to reveal its terrible, ugly, gory side before you can, you know, go, all right, let's leave on a high note.
Okay.
So there's that.
Fair enough. The next book that I'm going to talk about is a historical fiction novel. It's Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. This library copy is going to be very reflective. Anyway, I picked this one up because it is the family book club pick for July, so I read it with my sisters and my cousin. And I'm glad I finally got to it because I've heard nothing but really good things about this book. And it turns out it is actually a really good book. So this novel is following one Korean family through 4 generations, and it highlights their struggles and their triumphs while carving out a space for themselves in Japan, which is where they sort of moved to at the very start of this novel, or almost at the very start of this novel, as well as all the complicated relationships, whether internally in the family or externally, that they have throughout their lives. And much like another book that I talked about recently, there is a sort of detached way that this is written where I didn't really feel like I was with the characters or emotionally connected to the characters, and yet the writer's narrative prose is also engaging enough that I felt like I wanted to keep going whenever I picked up the book. I was a little worried that because it's pretty long and dense that it was going to take me a while to get through, but because of the writing style, I was like, every time I picked it up, I'm like, okay, I want to know what dramatic turn of events is going to take place next. I think what worked for me, considering that it wasn't the characters, what worked for me here was that I got to see another perspective on what a different part of history was like, because I don't really know much, obviously, about Korean history. I didn't know what their lives were like when they were taken over by Japan. I had no idea what it was like for them during the war as well, and to just have this author fictionalize an account that reflected the reality of a lot of Koreans during a very specific time period was interesting. It felt like I was learning something, but also, you know, being drawn into a story, and I love when that happens. It just really felt like I was having my eyes open to something else, and it made me sympathize a lot because it, you know, echoes a lot of history for other people who have gone through similar things in other, you know, countries as well. I did think that it was also great that it followed a family through 4 generations, because I do love those kinds of sagas where you see all these connections and like how they influence sort of the direction that their lives are going to take. So overall, I thought this was a very strong novel. It's not personally a new favorite, but I can see why it's gotten so much critical acclaim. So definitely glad that I finally got the chance to read this. And the last book that I get to talk about is one that I actually read in one sitting, and I was talking to Maki about it while I was reading it because I thought it was so interesting. So the book is The Ones We're Meant to Find, which is by Jonhe. This is essentially, before I started reading it, the summary that I had been given was that there was this girl and she wakes up on an island and she's all alone on the island, and she can't really remember how she got to the island or anything before that. The only thing she knows is that she has a sister who is somewhere off the island, and she is determined to find her way back to her. And I think I'll just leave the summary there, because going into it with the least amount of information possible is probably the best way to experience it. I can't speak for anyone who has experience with the comp titles to this story. One of them is Black Mirror. I can't really speak to anyone who has that experience because I don't really watch Black Mirror. I mean, I've watched my fair share of similar things, but not enough where I could really see the direction the story was going to take. I don't know if that'll be different for someone else who has, you know, immersed themselves in the genre more, but for me, I just, every time I turned a page or read a new chapter, I was just interested to see how the story was going to play out. Like, would she get off the island and find her sister? Is there something more sinister at play? It was just, it hooked me right from the start, and I definitely just felt the compulsive need to just keep going until I hit the end of the book. So, I mean, I think it says a lot about the story that I managed to finish it all in one go, because I just could not put it down once I'd started it. I really liked the fact that it focuses on a relationship between sisters, and I also liked all of the elements that were introduced as the story continues on. I think for me, like I actually read this author's debut novel. I thought it was okay. It was a fantasy story, had pretty typical fantasy elements to it. I thought it was still good, but this story, I think it was even better than that one, and I would like to see her write more in this genre. I do think this is the kind of story that will work for some readers, might not work for others, so I think, you know, it's up to you to decide whether or not this is the kind of story that would appeal to you. But personally for me, I thought it was very compelling. It felt very cinematic too, and I love that in my reads in this genre. I'm not even going to tell you what the genre is because it would kind of spoil things, but suffice to say, I was really impressed by this book in a way that I did not anticipate, and I'm so glad that I finally read it. Alright, so that is the end of this particular What We Read video. If you have thoughts on any of the books that we read, or if you're excited for any of them, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you want more content from us, you can like, you can subscribe to the channel, or you can check out any of our other relevant links, and we'll see you guys for another video soon. Bye!